Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my basement, this little corner of my basement I've got reserved for a special activity known as vermicomposting. And I call this section of my basement my wormery because vermicomposting is, as sort of the name sounds, is composting with worms. And as gross as it seems, it's really not that bad. It's kind of cool actually. I get to take a lot of my kitchen scraps that would otherwise end up in the trash and get hauled off to the landfill, and instead I feed it to the worms, and what they produce for me is this really nice compost that I could feed to my plants and my garden, and it just seems like a much better way to make use of the stuff that would otherwise be treated as trash. So I've got a system here that I plan on checking in on. It's a system that we last checked in on 10 days ago, and during that check-in they got moved into this container here. They were in a slightly smaller container because the population of that bin started out extremely small. And that last time we checked in on them 10 days ago, it seemed like it was a good time to upgrade them to a slightly larger container. As you can see, the start date of this container was on the 17th. Today's the 17th, but 4 months later. So the system's now 4 months of age. Usually I refer to the age of my systems by days or weeks. In this particular case, it seems realistic to refer to that as a 4-month-old system that was just upgraded 10 days ago to a larger space. Got a little bit of a feeding last time, but we're going to give them a little bit more. All they got last time was some coffee and some ground up bird seed. Today we're going to give them a somewhat larger feeding, and we're going to see how they're doing. So let's get them up on the bench and get them fed. Over on the label, you might have noticed all these little abbreviations. Basically, there are the types of worms that live in this container. It's a mix of different types of worms. So all those abbreviations, what they stood for was red wigglers, Indian blue worms, and European night crawlers. That's a common mix of worm types that work well together and live well together. And I just sometimes refer to that as my mixed population of worms. Alright, we got a couple worms hanging out on this plastic. We're going to fold it over to keep it moist so they don't get hit with a bunch of dry air and get them all upset. Here too we've got some castings material as well as a little wormy hanging out on this plastic bubble wrap. Wouldn't be surprising to find one on here too. Nope, here I don't see one. And what else do we have? We got a whole bunch of stuff going on out here. We got just a piece of newspaper draped out here across the top. This side you could tell is a lot higher than this side over here. This is the side that we built up for them. So all this stuff that had been in their old container that they used to live in was put on this side. And we figured we'd create a new zone instead of just kind of commingling everything. And I'm just curious to see if they've, taken to the new environment yet, because, oh, what have we here? Is this one worm or two? Sometimes I wonder. This has got to be one of the European night crawlers. It's a somewhat larger looking worm. I don't know, sometimes I can't tell. It might be a red wiggler. The other type of worm that you see right here next to it, these little skinny guys and much darker in color, and they're a lot faster too. Those are the Indian blue worms. The red wigglers and European night crawlers have distinct visual appearance characteristics that are similar, their coloration and stuff like that, their movement. The blue worms being a much speedier critter. Once it's exposed to the light and wants to flee, it's a much faster mover than most other worms. That definitely sets it apart. And I guess all this weird stuff we're removing here, the cardboard was to create darkness so that the clear plastic wouldn't become kind of a bright, scary place. If as long as it's dark, they're going to want to be there. And the top coverings, I like to have that as sort of a landing pad for the moisture that recirculates beneath the plastic. This top covering here, this coffee filter, is what I like to refer to as my feeding zone indicator. And I can even see a little bit of action. Worms have been nibbling on the edge of it already, which is kind of cool. So this finally leads us to the worm bin itself. You can see after, 4 months, they've really done a number on the environment that they used to live in. They've really chewed it all up. They've been just getting cardboard, paper, food scraps, and creating a nice compost out of it for me over time. And all we did on this side was pretty much empty their old box into this container for them after we had set up the opposite end of the bin as an extension of their existing environment, sort of an addition to their home. Not to mention that the home itself was replaced. So I figured we'd sort of browse around a little bit in here to see how the old material's coming along. And I've got this box here. It's loaded with leaves and it's topped off. One thing I've been trying to do in most of my systems is try to make better use of the available space. I try not to go right up to the rim because I don't want to end up getting myself into a situation where I'm unable to pile stuff up and shove things over and then end up, you know, creating a big mess because I'm pushing stuff over the edge and out of the container. But I think if I come up close to the rim, I could still leave myself just enough room to be able to do things the way I like to do them. And I'd like to see if I can even once again expand the space of this further for them. So I'm curious to see how they've taken to the new space. We didn't really put very tempting stuff out there. The food that was placed into that new end of the bin was just coffee and some pulverized birdseed, I believe. It's some of this stuff right here. Just some birdseed that I crushed up into little shreds in my little blender. So I'm curious to see if they've taken to that new environment or if it's still sort of a no man's land. That's where we're going to put today's feeding, and today's feeding might be a little bit more interesting for them. Some juicy fruits. You could see some strawberry bits in here. This is apple peels, which, I don't know, in my experience, apple usually goes a little bit slow in the worm bins. I mean, they'll eventually eat it, but it might take a while. Everything's been frozen. I've even got a couple very moldy rolls here. All this stuff is from my mom's house. So I don't know where those moldy rolls came from. Perhaps they were in the refrigerator, kind of got pushed onto a shelf in the back or something and got forgotten about. And then they just sort of surfaced. And maybe that's why they're so moldy. So, let's see here. So yeah, besides the worm chow and coffee, there was another kind of interesting object placed right smack down in the middle here. And everything does seem a little bit dry in here, and if it's dry, the worms are not going to be interested in going there. So it's not too surprising that there's not too much worm activity over there. We're going to go ahead and add those frozen foods, which will bring with them a little bit of moisture as they thaw, and hopefully help hydrate this material a little bit better. Perhaps we'll even give it a little squirt of water. It might not hurt. But that unusual object I made reference to a moment ago was a sunflower. A big object placed right into the middle here. And I'm already feeling it with my fingertips. We're starting to come upon it. In the spot, all the spots where all the sunflower seeds grow out of, I think I just poured coffee onto the top of it. And all those little holes were filled with coffee. And I'm actually seeing some worms hanging out over here. So evidently it's not so dry that it's scaring them away. Even here it looks like they've kind of started working their way down into the flour, finding themselves a little spot to hang out, which is kind of nice to see. Despite the fact that it feels a little bit dry to my hand, evidently it's still luckily damp enough that the worms are seemingly interested in it to a certain degree. So I thought that we might shove stuff over here and try to come up with sort of a new level. All the existing stuff was a little bit lower than the new stuff, but we've now sort of leveled everything off to the same height. But I'm coming up with sort of a cavity, an opening on the opposite end, where I thought perhaps we can even drop in some of these leaves for them. But I think, you know, what we should probably do in here before we proceed any further is give this whole system a little bit of moisture. So I've got my squirt bottle over here. It's got a little bit of water in it still, I could feel. And I'm not sure if I put it away with any pressure. Looks like I did. So we can get right to administering some moisture here. I think I'm going to go pretty generous on the moisture because this stuff feels like it could use it. So I'm just going to kind of keep going and going. And once we put those leaves in on the far end to create a little bit of bedding over on the far end, we'll go ahead and we'll dampen that stuff too, because that stuff's all dry out as well. But I'm going to go pretty generous on the moisture, I think, here. Really like for it to become a lot more interesting for the worms to go explore and hang out in. And my hope is that with some of these new foods that we're putting in here, it's going to attract them even better than what the coffee and the birdseed did. I think the first thing that really starts to happen is that the microbes and the microbiology within the material sort of has to get established. And then the worms tend to follow. And I think if we put in some nice juicy bits of fruits, strawberries and apples, I think that'll provide a much better foundation for that sort of activity to kick up a little bit better than what we put in here last time. And I would assume that by putting some leaves in here from outside, that stuff might also have a little bit of similar life lurking around within it too. So I think we've given a nice little dampening to this already. So why don't we proceed to the next step of, well, you know what, there's already a good foundation here. Why don't we proceed to dropping in these foods. I didn't have the nerve to take these out of the bag because they looked so moldy. But now is going to be the time to remove them and get a better look at what's really happening here. Wow. It's not only moldy, but there's a section of that roll that's even been so far gone by the mold that they've actually kind of removed a chunk of it. So the mold is really doing a number on this roll here. Working its way through. So let's put these in here. I don't know, in my experience, every time I come back into a worm bin where I've put some bread type foods in for the worms, it always seems like the worms are going bananas for this stuff, because I think they really like it. So let's start piling in some of this stuff here. It's frozen. I'll see what I could do about breaking some of it apart. This apple peel really was kind of in a big, massive frozen chunk when I took it out of the freezer earlier. So I wanted to let it sit for a little while so that it can perhaps thaw out enough that I can break it apart into little pieces. And just the process of this stuff thawing is also going to result in it dropping some of its moisture into the bin, which should be kind of nice. Yeah, I like that. I like the look of that already. So once again, we're going to use the stuff on my glove as a reason to administer a little bit more dampness. But let's not forget, we're putting in some dry leaves, and we're going to need to put in even more dampness, I think, on top of the leaves. Sometimes I'll, put in dry bedding materials like these dry leaves and then rely on just the moisture content of the bin to hydrate those dry materials just by the recirculating moisture beneath the plastic coverings. But here it seemed like it would make good sense to really be generous with the moisture and try to increase it significantly, because it did seem a little bit drier than it needed to be. Oh, that looks kind of cool. This is starting to remind me of, I don't know, when I was a kid, we used to sometimes get those ice cream packages that have the 3 different flavors in it. So we've got like 3 different sections here for the worms to explore. We've got the original material that they came over in from their old environment, plus we've got this combination of shredded paper and cardboard with the big sunflower down inside of it. And now we've just got a big pile of dry leaves. So in time, the worms will make their way over into the new stuff. But I got a feeling by dampening everything pretty thoroughly and by adding some foods that now have some sugar content to them, I think that'll help with the increased activity of microscopic organisms within the material, sort of kickstarting the breakdown process and then the worms will soon follow. So yeah, the stuff being a little bit dry, well, very dry, seems like it would benefit from getting a good bit of moisture. So I'm just going to keep going and going and going here, and we'll see where we end up. Alright, yeah, there's going to be a good bit of moisture dropped into here. And once we put the plastic coverings on, I think things will sort of balance out, sort of recirculate a little bit. Although the plastic coverings didn't really cause much of that to occur over the past 10 days. This stuff definitely seemed much drier than the existing vermicompost that was already starting to stack up from their old environment. But vermicompost has a good tendency to hang on to its moisture. Whether it was going to share that moisture, I guess maybe not, unless it was really overly damp. But I don't think it was overly damp, so maybe it just held on to its own moisture, perhaps shared a little bit of it with the neighboring materials. But I think by adding a whole bunch of moisture here the way we're doing now, it's probably going to help a lot too. Oh, but you know what? I also wanted to introduce a little bit of this stuff too, right? So maybe we're going to apply this as sort of a top feeding. This pulverized bird seed, just a nice dry, yet again a dry food being administered here. Right out over the top. Maybe if the worms start to come up to the top surface to hang out in the moisture that recirculates beneath the plastic, they'll be drawn to some of that and start to feed on that stuff too. So we'll give all of that stuff a nice little dampening as well, and I think we'll be finished here. Now I'm really starting to like the way the quantity of material in this system is stacking up. It's starting to look nice and, you know, well utilized space rather than just a bunch of vacant space. Seems to me like if you give the worms a lot of area to roam around and explore, they'll sense that available space and try to fill it with baby worms. So why not do that, right? Alright, things are looking really cool in here. Definitely like the way this system's looking. It's just interesting, you know, how there's like various stages of old, medium, and brand new stuff. And I got a feeling with all that fresh food applied in this end, as well as just the leaves themselves, are not only bedding. Everything that goes in as bedding eventually becomes food too, but the leaves almost seem like a material that's equally food and bedding. The paper seems like it's more bedding and in time becomes food too. I don't know, not sure how to classify these things correctly. But I think you get the idea. So we're losing pressure here. There's not a lot of water coming out of this thing anymore, but I don't even think we need much more. We've really dumped in a good bit of moisture. And hopefully by the next time we come in to check in on the system, things are going to be a lot more damp and more heavily populated with worms. So we'll see. I'm bringing back my feeding zone indicator to show ourselves where we last fed over on this edge. And you know, this is almost starting to come across as one of those perpetual sort of continuous flow type systems. Some people refer to it as like kind of a wedge layout. And I don't mind, you know, running a system that way. It's kind of interesting to treat one end as the end of the bin where you continuously keep adding new stuff, pushing the more finished worked material to the opposite edge. And a lot of people run systems like that in such a way that in time they'll just start scooping out the finished compost from the end where all the worked material is already, opening up more and more room on the opposite end to keep adding more fresh bedding and food. And then there's really no beginning or end. It's just perpetually continuing to work that way. And well, you know, I had these two individual pieces of top covering plastic, and then in came a third plastic bag. I'm wondering how I could make the best use out of this stuff to get maximum coverage across as much of the material in the system as possible. Why don't we try to arrange the bubble wrap over on this side, and then we'll see what we could do about bringing in this plastic bag in such a way that it covers the rest. Yeah, worms hanging out on this stuff. It seems like we didn't scare them away by putting them out into the bright lights, which is good. If they'd gotten scared out of there and ran out onto the table, they would have not been comfortable there because it's very dry there. Yeah, this looks like it should work pretty good. I think we've got much better coverings over on this side. On the material that looks like it has a greater likelihood of drying and losing its existing moisture content, whereas the side that's more heavily processed is already quite capable on its own to hang on to its moisture. So this is really just meant to provide them with a little darkness, a little shade, so that during the daylight hours, even after I shut all the lights off, there's still a little bit of daylight in here, so that they feel comfortable just hanging out here on the top layers in the shade that the cardboard coverings provide. So that's it for the video, everyone. I've got a few things I got to take care of cleaning up and putting away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's boring. Before I go really quick, just let me say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.